Okay, I think that we can start. First of all, I would like to welcome you all for today's lecture of Professor Vasileios Syros on the theme Notions of Cosmopolitanism in Pre-Modern Islam and Judaism. Most of you who are familiar with the history of this institute and focused research know that this is a bit unusual to work on something which involves kind of pre-modern world and also religion. But I think that it corresponds to certain trends in theory, social theory and humanities today, and I will try to pinpoint at the beginning what are the trends which fits in modern today's talk. First of all, you're probably all aware with this shift, which very contemporary shift from secularity to post-secularity, and there are several kind of historical events and theoretical events that led to this kind of shift or change. First of all, I will try to stress Jürgen Habermas' call to replace this relationship of conflict between religion and secularity. And this appeal actually was a result, or was a part result of all this religious violence happening in Europe. And he was the first giving his example and his dialogue with Cardinal Ratzinger, former Pope, that religion and secularism should establish a dialogue. The second thing, and I would define this as a kind of, let's say, a rational argument of connecting religion and secularity. The second is Umberto Eco's insistence that we have to admit that human being is also a religious animal, and that we don't want to put aside this very important aspect as being a homo faber or homo sapiens. Human being is also homo religiosus, and we have to admit that this is one of the, if not main, but a very important component of human being. And the third, and this kind of aspect, I would say anthropological, it's anthropological. And the second thing is what the Spanish sociologist José Casanova stressed, that in order to admit religion in a public space, religion or organized religion in churches should learn how to behave in this public space, and this includes that it should they should respect human rights and at least basic values and structure of secular times. In this sense, I would just stress that any kind of return to pre-modern time in post-secular period would be impossible. In post-secularity also includes post-modernity. Then all these three elements are in some sense present in today's talk. Professor Syros will focus on topic of world rulership, the role of religious minorities, and reception of Greco-Roman theories about cosmopolitanism. When we talk about world rulership, we have this kind of political segment. When we talk about the role of religious minority, we have this kind of anthropological segment. And if we talk about the reception of Greco-Roman theories about cosmopolitanism, we have a rational segment stressed by Jürgen Habermas. Before I give a floor to Professor Syros, I would like to introduce him. He is having a lot of positions and fellowships. At the moment, he is a project director of Finnish Academy in Helsinki, working on a project Political Power and the Early Modern European and Islamic Worlds. He He is a fellow of Europainstitut at the University of Basel. He is a senior fellow of Descartes Centre for History and Philosophy and Science and Humanities of the University of Utrecht. Professor Syros did his PhD at the University of Heidelberg and his habilitation at the University of Helsinki. He had several postdocs at the University of Munich and University of Sorbonne. He had a long list of visiting, research and teaching fellowship. I will just mention fellowships at the University of Chicago, University of Ghent, University of Edinburgh, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, University of Göteborg, Wisconsin-Madison University, University of Louvain, and University of Columbia, Stanford, and Princeton. He is the author of 3 books, 2 books on Marsilius of Padua, one in English, published with Toronto University Press, another published in German with Brill, and he was the editor of a book which explores heritage of Aristotle in Arabic, Syriac, Byzantine, and Latin sources. I ask Professor Syros.
Thanks a lot. It's a great honor to be here at the Institute. My friend Vladimir has done a great job telling me about Serbia, Belgrade. It's my first time in this country, in this city, so I'm very excited to be in Belgrade. I have so much about your country, and Gazela, thank you very much for your invitation and hospitality. So this talk is about concepts of religious toleration in pre-modern Islam in Europe, primarily in the 16th and 17th century. And as Vladimir said, we're inclined to think of toleration as something very modern, very Western, very distinctive, and of course toleration is something that goes back to John Locke, who is a progenitor of the liberal theory of toleration, but also to Spinoza. Spinoza has a very interesting distinction, which Vladimir touched upon in his introduction of the public and private sphere. And that's a very important point that I think it provides a very important key for exploring ideas about toleration in pre-modern Islam and Europe. Now, I should mention that toleration is not, the pre-modern concept of toleration is very different from the modern concept of toleration in a Western, democratic, liberal setting where people are citizens, they have equal rights, and they partake of certain rights, privileges, at least in the public arena, public sphere. But we have the first attempts, the first endeavors to articulate the concept of toleration that prefigures our modern concept of toleration in 16th, 17th century Jewish and Islamic political thought. And Vladimir kindly asked me to cover these 2 traditions because normally we talk about Christian stuff, about Western traditions, and we're somehow uncertain about how these traditions envision toleration, especially in the context of the political configuration, the constellation that prevailed in 16th century Europe and the Islamic world. And it's also very interesting that we talk here about 2 traditions that have very different premises. One is the Jewish tradition that evolves in Europe, especially in Italy, where you have Jews living in small communities, and we have the first ghettos in Venice, for example. But there's no sense of statehood. There's no state, there's no ruler, there's no sovereign supporting those communities. And there is a memory of statehood of ancient Israel that is still there. But we don't necessarily have an appeal, we don't have a project, a program for the creation of a separate political entity that will accommodate the Jews. On the other hand, we have in the Islamic world the existence and formation of large Islamic multi-confessional, multi-ethnic empires that starts, of course, with the fall of Constantinople and the creation of the Ottoman Empire. And in Islam, we have 2 major phases. One is the, I would call the Arab phase that starts with the early Islam, and we have the gradual decline of the Islamic tradition in Spain, and then the fall of the Islamic empires, and the fall of the Abbasids, and the incursion, the influx of the Mongols in the Islamic world. And that's the first phase of Islam. And the main language that serves as a vehicle, as a medium for expression of philosophical ideas in Islam is Arabic. The second phase starts with the creation of the so-called Central and Eastern Islamic empires. We have the Ottomans, we have the Safavids, what we call Iran today, and we have the Mughals, a small dynasty that took over India and created a large empire. And there you have a very interesting discourse about toleration. So we have in Islam one period, the Arabic period, and we have a number of writings in Arabic that deal with toleration and world rulership, produced, by example, very prominent philosophers. One of these philosophers is Al-Farabi in Islam in the 9th century, who writes in Arabic. Originally he was from Central Asia, he wasn't an ethnically Arab writer, but he uses Arabic as a medium of writing philosophy, as we do English or French or German nowadays. And you have there a very interesting endeavor to articulate the vision of a world city, Medina, that comes from the Greek vocabulary, a world city that espouses Islamic beliefs, right? It's like a utopian, it's a perfect society and a perfect ruler where people participate, they have distinct functions. And underlying this vision of a world city, of a global city, is the vision of the ever-expanding Islam. Because Islam has this vision of expansion and creating a world society, a world community that is premised in Islamic beliefs and principles. And it's interesting that in Islam you don't have, at least in that period, you don't have the term state, you have the term city. Medina is the equivalent of the Greek word city. So in their imagination, the whole world is a large city that accommodates different groups, different professions, different ranks, different professional groups, and is run by a perfect ruler who is depicted, according to Al-Farabi, after Plato. So Al-Farabi, in a sense, receives the Greek tradition, receives the Platonic legacy, he marries it, he synthesizes with other elements from the existing Sasanian traditions in Iran, with Islamic principles, and creates a vision of a world ruler, a vision of a sovereign, a world sovereign, who is a kind of Islamicized version of philosopher king we have in Plato. So the philosophers like Al-Farabi have this distinct vision about what we call cosmopolitanism, or world city, or world state, that's also indebted to the vision of Alexander the Great as a world ruler. And that's very important because among all the pagan rulers and sovereigns, Alexander the Great, Iskandar, enjoys a very important position. So for them, Alexander represents, in a sense, the model. He epitomizes what we call world rulership, a leader with unique abilities who's trying to expand his rule and creates the first true world state. So people know more about Alexander than about the Roman Empire, and at times the Roman Empire is somehow foreign to philosophical discourse. But in the 16th century, we have a new phase in Islamic meditation about world rulership or world citizenship, and by default cosmopolitanism, with the creation of these three empires. And one of the major differences here is that we have people using Persian as the main language of writing about philosophy. So Arabic is being replaced by Persian, which becomes again the lingua franca, the Latin of that period. And the second very important factor is we have here the consolidation of power structures, of the political machinery, of the state apparatus, that in a sense prefigures the modern state. And we often think that Islam has a distinct concept of statehood as compared to Europe, for example, to the West. But there are very important affinities and commonalities. And in this period you have, again, the first systematic attempt by a number of thinkers to dissect, to explore the mechanics involved in statehood. And a very important factor here is that there is a gradual shift from the persona of the sovereign, of the ruler, to the power structures, the mechanisms, the factors involved in creating a powerful, prosperous state. Because in the past, people would talk about the persona of the king, of the philosopher king, for example, the sovereign, and they would deal more with the personal attributes, skills, characteristics of a specific ruler. Here we have gradual shift from attention to broader structures. And the same happens in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. You have thinkers like Machiavelli, we all know Machiavelli, right? Who writes about the persona of the ruler, of the prince, who acquires a new state and has the abilities to sustain the state and create a powerful polity. But in the 16th century, there are thinkers in Europe like Jean Bodin, for example, a famous legal scholar in France, who writes the famous book, Les 6 Livres de la République, the 6 books of the Republic. A republic here is not the Republic, the Roman Republic, is a generic term that designates different forms of organization or regime types. And there, Bodin, in a sense, illustrates the main features, the main characteristics that define the modern state, the different organs, the different departments of the administration that are involved in the process of governing a state. And another very important thinker who writes about these topics, and again advocates the shift of emphasis from the persona of the ruler, of the sovereign, to the state, to the power structures and features of the state, is a very famous Jesuit scholar, Giovanni Botero, who writes a famous book about the greatness and magnificence of cities in 1588. So in this context, you have a number of thinkers in Europe who write from a perspective of ethnic religious minorities. You have Jewish thinkers who write in Venice, and they try to carve out space for their existence and their operation within this very important power structures that have been consolidated throughout Europe. And there are two very important factors that influence and color their perceptions of what we call cosmopolitanism. One is that in Europe, as you know, there is a series of wars of religion, religious conflict. So every thinker who writes about these topics, every political writer writes in light of these debates, of these conflicts. And deep down, they all try to provide remedies, solutions for this conflict. So Jean Bodin, for example, belongs to a group of thinkers who advocate a strong state that can guarantee sort of unity, cohesion, and domestic peace. Other thinkers write about skepticism. They advocate skepticism as a way to address the problem, and they advocate the distinction, the dichotomy, if you wish, between the public and private sphere. And Jewish thinkers try to engage with these debates and, in a sense, highlight the benefits they bring to their host cities. At the same time, they want to carve out space for their own religious rights and their own tradition, and reconcile the public and private aspects of religion. One of these writers is a famous rabbi in Venice in the 17th century, Simone Luzzatto. Simone Luzzatto was a rabbi who wrote a famous book about the contribution of the Jews to the Venetian economy. And that's a very important book. Why? Because first of all, he tries to address in this book accusations raised against the Jews regarding a major scandal of bribery of the judiciary of Venice. So it's a programmatic pamphlet, tract that addresses this problem, and he's trying to convince the authorities not to expel the Jews from Venice. And at the same time, he's trying to show in this book, it's a short book, that the Jewish religion is not incompatible with Christianity. And one of the major points he raised in his book is that a number of Jewish traditions, rites, and histories in the Bible had a profoundly political character. For example, there's a famous story about Absalom, the son of David, who, in a sense, goes against his father. He stages a coup d'etat, and he sides with the advisor of his father, Ahithophel. And this is an abortive attempt. At the end, Absalom gets killed, and Ahithophel commits suicide. But Jewish writers justify the plot against David as an act of realpolitik. And a major point here is that Ahithophel tries to convince Absalom to pretend that he has sexual intercourse with the concubines of his father, which is a major statement. And that, in their perception, is a major act of realpolitics, of political pragmatism that will show, that will help Absalom show to his adherents and soldiers that his relationship with his father, David, will not prevail upon his plan to take over power. And there are similar debates in the Ottoman tradition about Suleiman the Magnificent, who kills his son because his son rebels against Suleiman the Magnificent, and he orchestrates the assassination of his son. There are debates about to what extent this kind of act is permissible, legitimate, or illicit according to the religious principles, or according to the precepts of politics. Because politics becomes a distinct sphere from religion. And here we have again debates about the public and private sphere in Judaism. So Luzzatto, for example, writes about a public sphere, a public arena, where Jews can be part of transactions, they can contribute to trade, the economy, while at the same time retaining their religious culture and traditions in their private sphere. And in this sense, he creates a vision of cosmopolitanism that is indebted to Montaigne and other skeptical writers who operate on the same principle, on the same distinction between what we call the public sphere, the public realm, where people contribute to society, where people exhibit their loyalty, their commitment to the existing institutions and cultures, but at the same time they retain, they preserve their traditions and values in their private sphere, in the private realm. And there, Luzzatto writes interestingly that Judaism has a distinctly cosmopolitan character in the sense that the law of Moses was not created for a specific nation, but it considered the entire world, the entire humankind. And there, there's a contrast, according to Luzzatto, with the pagan lawgivers in the ancient world who framed laws and constitutions for specific cities or nations or countries. So we have Solomon, we have a number of ancient pagan lawgivers who go to the city and frame laws and constitutions with an eye to the conditions and arrangements of a specific city. And that's the old model of the so-called nomothetes, the so-called lawgiver whose task is to provide legislation for a specific city. And Solomon, of course, is the most famous example, or Lycurgus, of this model. But for Luzzatto, the Jewish tradition accommodates the concerns of different nations and different groups and different states. A similar way to address religious diversity in the Islamic world in the same period is an effort made by the famous Mughal Emperor Akbar to create a new religion, a new what I would call mega religion. So Akbar, being the ruler of a large state which was composed by different groups, ethnic religious groups, but was predominantly Hindu, run by a small Muslim minority, is trying to consolidate his power in this setting by creating a new religion. And this religion, which he designates as Din Ilahi, as a divine religion, aims at incorporating features and elements from diverse religious traditions like Judaism, like Christianity, like Hinduism. And Akbar himself sponsored debates by religious scholars at his court, and even invited the Jesuits to visit his court and debate, reflect on matters of religion and doctrines. We have a very vivid account of this effort to promote cosmopolitanism and create a world state based on what we call religious uniformity, promoted by Akbar, in a book written by Akbar's what we call prime minister, Grand Vizier, Abul Fazl. So Abul Fazl was a prominent intellectual who came from a very important Sufi family, and he was the right hand, he was the prime minister to Akbar. And he wrote a book, it's called the Precepts of Akbar, Ayn Akbar, and the third book is about religious diversity and the ways in which Akbar tried to impose or to promote the unity of this state and the creation of a world society, a world state, a world polity based on religious tolerance and the creation of a new religion. Now, a common feature in both traditions in this period is a distinct emphasis on trade and economy. Luzzatto writes about the ability of a free trade, of a free market, to accommodate and provide space for religious groups of different beliefs. And a major point in the discourse is that Jews have the capacity, thanks to their network across the Mediterranean, thanks to their history, thanks to their tradition, to contribute to the economy. So in a sense, trade here is elevated into a factor, into a mechanism that brings people together and promotes transactions among different religious, ethnic groups. And by default, trade becomes the driver of cosmopolitanism and also safeguards balance of power among different nations, different states. And for most of the thinkers who write in Italy in the 17th century, the main point is not the creation of a world state, but rather balance of power. And this is a very important debate in the 16th century because we have thinkers who want to have a world state able to safeguard world unity, to safeguard cohesion, and to act as a global policeman in a sense throughout the world. And a very famous author who writes about this issue is Tommaso Campanella, a religious author who writes about the Habsburg monarchy as a purveyor of world rulership. In this way, Campanella is much closer to the Islamic thinkers who again subscribe to the concept of world rulership. But in Italy, many thinkers who write about this problem and who write about interstate relations are committed to the idea of balance of power among different states that are able to counterbalance each other and sort of safeguard a peaceful international landscape. And in this sense, cosmopolitanism, trade, and balance of power are interconnected because, of course, trade is a way to promote peace, to have relations with your neighbors, to engage in transactions. Of course, trade can be used as an economic weapon against certain countries, as it happens nowadays. But in general, trade has a potential to cultivate world peace and friendship on different nations and states. In the Islamic world, we have a very different conception of world state. We have a belief, we have the vision of the world state run by a Muslim regime or a Muslim minority of rulers, and Akbar is a very good example of how Islamic thinkers were debating about the necessity for a world state in that period. And in this whole setting, again, trade becomes a very important factor. Why? Because as Abul Fazl writes in his book about Akbar, in his narrative about Akbar's rule, the world is a big market, is a large market. And in the process of creating a society, there are two distinct phases. One is a phase where people live in a kind of state of nature, to use Hobbes. They live without any kind of statehood, by themselves, and at some point they realize the need to come together and create a city or political community. That's the first kind of contract or agreement that aims at creating a community. The second is when the members of this primordial community decide to appoint a ruler, a sovereign, to suppress, to erase civil strife and discord. Because the very fact that people come together and they transact, they exchange different products, different goods, and they also have different skills and abilities, creates friction, right? It creates competition and discord. And in order to deal with discord and sustain the peace of society, they need to appoint a sovereign, a ruler, being able to suppress those elements that can subvert, that can erode the domestic harmony and peace. And that's the second part of the deal, of the contract. And there, Abul Fazl writes about the need of the market to, in a sense, to promote and safeguard harmonious relations among the members of society who engage in constant trade and transactions. So in a sense, we have here another sphere that becomes independent and distinct from government, that is the market, that has its own rules, its own regulations, and the ruler is responsible for regulating those transactions and protecting that sphere, the market. And it's very interesting that in all these debates about cosmopolitanism, world citizenship, and the need for a world community, the ruler is not portrayed as part of the state or of the political community. In the medieval period, there is a distinct conception of the ruler, of the government, as part of the body politic. So the ruler is the equivalent of the heart or the brain in the political organism. And the different parts of the state, the artisans, the craftsmen, the army, the priests correspond to different parts of the natural body, of the physical organism, right? And thinkers play with these metaphors and create different analogies between the different parts of the state and the parts of the human organism, the organs of the human body. But in all these versions, the ruler is an integral part of the body politic, either the brain or the heart. And that applies to Islam, it applies to Christianity, and also applies to Judaism. But in the early modern period, in the 16th century onwards, we have the effort to extricate the ruler, the sovereign, from the body politic. So the ruler is portrayed as a doctor, as a physician, with the know-how, with the skills and abilities to heal the body politic and ensure its health and smooth operation, but he's no longer part of the body politic. And this is an important transition development because, first of all, it reflects a new medical model, a new social vision that is indebted to Galen's theory of the four humors. Galen has a theory about the four humors in the human body that are portrayed by a number of writers in the 16th century as the equivalent of the four main parts or three main parts of the body politic. But the important thing here is that the ruler is no longer part of the state, and the ruler does not own the state. So even if the ruler dies or is deposed, the state will exist and will have its own operation, its own rules, its own mechanisms that are conducive to its perpetuation. And that will be a new ruler, a new government, a new regime that will take care of all the aspects that relate to government and sustaining this body politic. And it's very interesting that in early Islam, that's why I started with this distinction between early Islam and later Islam, we have a very strong conception of a dynastic state. So you have a dynasty that creates a state, but once the dynasty is over, once the dynasty is disposed, we have a new state, a new dynasty taking over and creating a new political configuration or formation. And a very good example of this notion of dynastic states is Ibn Khaldun, the very famous historian who writes about the cycle of regimes and the role of dynasties in creating political communities, from life in the desert to urban life, what he calls urban life. So we have here a number of approaches to world citizenship and cosmopolitanism, the way we have it in the way people write about these topics in the pre-modern world, enunciated by thinkers who belong to very different traditions, but they converge, I think, on very important points. One is the idea of trade and economy as a factor that can promote and safeguard harmony, friendship among nations, and can sort of enhance the perception of once being a member of a world community that is constantly engaged in transactions, in trade, in economic dealings. And the other very important concept is, I think, the belief in what I said earlier, what I designated public and private. And I think there is a distinct need to reassess the interplay of the public and private aspects of religion when it comes to pre-modern Islam and Judaism. So nowadays we're inclined to think of Islam as something very recalcitrant, very aggressive, very extreme, and we are often oblivious to the fact that in the Islamic traditions there were voices that advocated cosmopolitanism in a pre-modern variant. And the same applies to Judaism. We think of Judaism as a close religion, a small group of people who adhere to a certain religion. And in Soviet Russia, cosmopolitan was even anathema because the Jews were supposed to be too cosmopolitan, and that was used as part of propaganda against the Jews. But even in that case, we have Jewish thinkers who try to enlighten their audience, and they try to advocate a very interesting conception of public and private that applies to their own existence and the operation of Jewish religion in pre-modern Europe. And of course, Spinoza responds to these questions, responds to these problems by writing that there's a strong sovereign, and that's the public arena, the public sphere, but at the same time, there's a private sphere where people have their own beliefs, and the sovereign, the state, has the right or must enforce and enhance those beliefs that are conducive to the welfare of the entire state. One very important distinction here is that we don't have a modern conception of citizenship the way we have it today. Jews do not want to become citizens, they want to be part of the city, right? They want to have the room and space to exercise their function, their religion, but we don't yet have a distinct quest for citizenship and equal rights the way we have it in later thinkers like Marsilius, for example. But I do believe that by reassessing the importance of the public and private in this whole discourse about cosmopolitanism, religious toleration, and the role of minorities in what we call the creation of the modern state, both in Islam and in Europe, one be able to identify new affinities and commonalities between these two traditions that are not totally foreign to us. Thank you.